Good evening. My name is Bruce Montgomery, and thank you for joining me on another edition of Technology Access Television. Well, today we're going to talk about the most important subject that we could possibly talk about, and that is thinking. Of course, that's right. You cannot do anything that your mind doesn't conceive that you can do. And today we're going to talk with a leader that teaches how to think strategically. In the business world or in any world, what we think about is what we bring about. And we can't demonstrate anything beyond our own consciousness. So this is a critical subject. It's not just for business schools or for MBAs. It's for anyone who's involved with any level of an organization and wants that organization to be effective, to have an impact. Well, there's a lot that we've learned over the years as we studied this area. And I'm pleased that my guest today is one who has taken his time out of actually practicing in this field of strategic thinking and execution to write a book that is a guidepost on how to apply these understandings that we've come to learn work, why they work, and sometimes you can learn from what hasn't worked, and by having this kind of resource, you can grow as a result. My guest today is B.K. Simerson from Northwestern University. B.K., thank you for joining me.
Oh, I appreciate your having me.
All right, and while your colleague could not be here today, Aaron Olson,
Yes.
You two teamed up to produce this very important work, Leading with Strategic Thinking. And I'm delighted that we can talk about this upcoming book with you here today.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity. Aaron and I have been co-instructing at Northwestern University for about the last 7 years. And this is a topic that we're especially interested in, and also that happens to be the title of our course.
Well, as a Northwestern alum, people are going to think I'm playing favorites, but you guys came well past my time to come to this great institution. And tell us a little bit about your own personal background. I understand that not only are you in the professor ranks, the ranks of academia, but you spend most of your time out in the real world. And what do you do in your business practice?
Right. Well, I'm I'm a sole practitioner. And I work with different consulting firms, primarily around strategic planning, leadership development, and change management. But I've worked with organizations, mainly for-profit organizations, across more than 16, 17 industries. I've worked with various federal government agencies as well as all the branches of the military. But I typically help organizations either set their strategy or more effectively or more efficiently execute their strategy. And oftentimes that takes us into the world of either leadership or leadership development or change management.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that because it seems today that in some cases we feel there is a vacuum of leadership. We feel that organizations are tied to some practices, whether it's government, whether it's nonprofit, that they just kind of lumber on. But, we always think that organizations, well, don't they have a strategy review? Don't we lay some of these things on the table and decide how to pick them up again and reshuffle the deck? So when you are working with your students, what backgrounds do they come from when you provide your teaching in this area of strategic thinking and execution?
Gosh, we have a wide range of students. We have students from around the world. We have students who are very active. Many are solo practitioners in public sector, private sector organizations. Some are in very large organizations that are international or global. Many are in organizations that just consist of a handful.
And are these people that are working on a graduate degree, or are they working on a certificate, or just learning what's currently up to speed in this area of strategic thinking and execution?
A clear majority of our students are graduate level, full-time or part-time students. Many have been out of the undergraduate program for 5, 6, or 7 years. Most have very responsible positions, either as a manager, an executive, or a leader. Many are sole contributors, but they are all very sharp, and they all have that desire to learn. And not only learn, but apply what they've learned. We do from time to time have a certificate program student who is there just for a handful of courses. But again, most are either full or part-time graduate level students.
So talk about the fundamental thesis or premise of this work. How did you come at this point in your career after being through the woods, having so many experiences, working in this broad variety of industry? What made you feel compelled that it's time to document what I've seen out here in the real world and bring it to bear on a text right now?
Well, it's interesting you say that and ask that because Aaron and I started teaching together about 7.5 years ago. And we many times have been asked by students, so what exactly is strategic thinking? And when my supervisor or colleague or neighbor comes and asks, how can you be more strategic? Or when they recommend that I think more strategically, exactly what does that mean? What might it entail? Because of what we teach, Aaron and I started doing a lot of research. We started incorporating some of the lessons learned and best practices that we've experienced out in the field. Aaron, he acts as the Chief Talent Officer for Aon Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a myriad of challenges and opportunities before him. And because I've worked with various organizations, I've consulted and coached executives around the world, we thought that we could bring to bear some of our learnings.
So let's talk about some of those
Yes.
insights. Let's just dive right in. What are some of the misconceptions when it comes to what people think strategy is or isn't? What are some of the fundamental premises that you like to get? We talked about this before we got going on camera.
Yes.
How do you level set what strategy is and what strategy isn't?
Well, you know, it's interesting because when it comes to strategy, it's really, if you want to put one definition to it, it is the highest level means to an end. Mm-hmm. So if your strategic intent is to go from point A to point B, then the strategies that you develop is basically the actions you will take and the roadmap that you will follow to get from point A to point B. One of the things that we like to point out is that that result or outcome, that point B, cannot be simply measured by the spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. It cannot be the financial result. The financial result is something that occurs in the distant future, but your short-term results and outcomes, the value that you bring to your customers, your clients, the value that you bring to your local community, as well as how you help your contributors, your employees, your associates, help them develop.
Everybody says that.
Right.
And that seems like good common sense. But now we seem to be in a world that is so bought into analytics and metrics. Right. And so we've been through the balanced scorecard and now we've got, you know, the dashboards that all C-level people are supposed to have. But it still seems like we're missing stuff. We're missing this real thought about qualitative and quantitative engagement, right. You know, talking about this broad realm of stakeholders. So how do you get through that this is really good business? This isn't just, you know, doing the right thing for the right people, right. And really being concerned about impact actually results in you end up maybe performing or outperforming your peers. But why hasn't this message caught hold?
I think because we've been too isolated in our thinking and we've been directing and devoting our attention to ourselves. When we start looking at our return on investment and how we're doing in terms of our competitors, and not only that, when we really evaluate how we're doing in terms of delivering our value to our customers, our clients, to our local community, we see that we fall short. And so that leads us to ask, so what could we be doing differently that we're doing now, or what do we need to begin doing that we have not done in the past? And that's the key to our book.
So do you give, let's talk about some of the insights, because one of the things that I like so much about the approach you've taken is you have the most broad range of case studies you looked at. You have people from the venture capital community, from the startup community, from the industrial community, from the public sector. How did you extract from all of these experiences these key insights which then could be applied back across that broad range of industries? What are some of those key insights? And so when we think about just the formulation of strategy, right. What's the first kinds of steps that people should take to rethink their proposition, their strategic approach? What are some of the steps that you like to say, this is how you put them in some different buckets to begin to understand how to move forward?
Well, the first thing we'd recommend is that you step back and ask, so what do I mean when I say that I'm going to think strategically? And what we like to say is that if you're going to be a strategic thinker, there's really three things that you have to keep in mind. You have to keep in mind what are some of the occurrences that are occurring out in the environment, whether it's the local community or region or national or the world. What are some of those happenings, and what are some of the things that we need to take into consideration as we decide where we're going, where we want our destination to be or our destination to become? So you really have to scan the environment, try to identify explore, understand, and recognize patterns. What are some of the trends? What are some of the patterns that are either going to be an obstacle or an enabler? We also recommend that you keep in mind that if you are a strategic thinker, you also have to think about risk. You have to recognize all the forces, all the factors out there that are either potential risk or are already risks that you've failed to recognize. And you have to decide, how are we going to reduce, how are we going to mitigate, how are we going to sidestep some of these risks? And then finally, if you're going to be a strategic thinker, it requires more than simply thinking. You have to draw conclusions, you have to make decisions, and not only do they have to be decisions, they've got to be credible decisions.
Now, another word that's kind of been maximizing the airspace of this strategic discussion, of course, is the term innovation.
Right.
And America's become fixated with this term innovation. But the intersection between strategic thinking, risk management, risk aversity, and innovation seem to conflict. How does innovation ever happen in the mindset of a strategic thinker?
And you know, it's interesting you say that, because we created a three-pronged framework that we really like to use to describe and illustrate what it really means to be a strategic thinker and a strategic leader. And the three elements of that framework begins with cognitive psychology. And you know, if you think about cognitive psychology, that's all about creativity, it's about decision making, it's about problem solving, and it's about all the questions that we currently ask, the questions we emphasize, versus the questions that are left unasked that we really do need to focus on or emphasize. If you think about cognitive psychology, individuals, kind of like their personality, they have a natural desire to focus on either the kind of questions that will broaden your understanding or the kind of questions that deepen your understanding. We recommend that both are required, both are needed.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because you make me think, and I can really tell you're a great teacher, because you have such a passion for this subject, and it really comes out. But you make me think about two things. You make me think about the notion of how can you innovate if you're just so wrapped up in your comfort zone? How do you move out of a comfort zone to think and have some empathy for the trends that are going on? It seems that that's such a big issue today, because companies are just plodding along, but the world is calling out to be heard, to be appealed to be sensitive. And yet sometimes it seems like companies have to get smacked upside the head to pay attention to, their employees are calling out, their markets are calling out, their suppliers are calling out. And sometimes it takes tragedy for companies to say, Jesus, we're missing some of this stuff. And then the other part, maybe not, it's a part of that same coin, is blind spots.
Right.
So then when you look at some of our greatest companies, they've been able to accept that something was outside of their comfort zone.
Right.
And so they said, we don't understand this, we don't know a lot about it, but we're going to know something about it, because this is not going away. And so when you look at strategic thinking, how does the strategic thinking model adapt to getting out of comfort zones and dealing with blind spots?
And I know that we didn't practice that question, but it seems like we did, because it automatically leads me to the two remaining parts of our framework. We really believe that systems thinking is an absolute necessity.
And break that down for a little bit, systems thinking.
Systems thinking is a discipline, it's a school of thought that focuses on organization systems, and it discusses the complexity of the system, how different systems interact between and among themselves, as well as with the external environment. And so a lot of times we work with organizations where they have a natural tendency to focus solely on technology. And so when they're wanting to bring about change, when they're wanting to bring about innovation, it's all about technology. And what we like to say is, take a step back, broaden your perspective, and focus on your overarching strategy, your processes, your systems, your internal contributors, your employees, your associates, their capacity and capability, as well as the need and expectations of your clients. Not just what you prefer, which might be technology.
Describe a couple of, in your book again, because your book is a case study based book.
Yes.
Talk about some of the success stories, some of the people, like you have Nelson Mandela mentioned in the book. What did you learn from studying Nelson Mandela? I mean, what could we not learn from studying
Oh,
that? But what from strategic thinking, what did you pick up from Nelson Mandela?
Well, one of the things that we discovered in our research is that there are basically 4 different strategic leadership types. The directive, the second, and that takes me directly to Nelson Mandela. He was an individual who focused on collaboration. And if you think about when apartheid ended in 1994, he had a challenge. His challenge was to create a trusting environment, a trusting community, an inclusive community, a community that will allow individuals to contribute to their destiny and the destiny of their fellow citizens. And it's interesting because when he thought about, so how are we going to bring about such an environment? How are we going to create that environment given what we've experienced over the last several decades? And what he decided was, if you're wanting to create an inclusive society, then you include others in creating that society. So he created a commission. It was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It had many councils under it, but he invited the citizens to decide and really provide guidance into what is this society going to become, how are we going to relate to each other, how will we in the future live as one. He had a vision. He put a lot of structure to his vision, and because he knew that to involve many, you have to have a very tight structure. Mm-hmm. But he brought individuals together, he shared his power, and in doing so, he created the society that is there today.
Well, I think what's so delightful about your book, Thinking Strategically, is that you, by incorporating models as diverse as Nelson Mandela,
yes.
as diverse as Indiegogo, as diverse as Procter & Gamble,
yes.
that you talk about from the specific, because part of the reason we're having this conversation today is a mutual friend of ours, Jose Ignacio Sordo,
yes.
who had this very unique challenge within the context of course, one of the paradigms of marketing and management, P&G. Yet as these companies have expanded globally,
right.
sometimes moves that they make in consolidating and buying different entities create very, very unique kinds of problems. So the manager who has to work through that practical area doesn't have the luxury of being at the corporate office and can smoke a pipe and take his time.
Exactly.
I mean, he's thrown right in the middle of the fire. So what did you learn as you pull some of those practical examples? Because again, you go from Nelson Mandela to a Jose Ignacio. What did you learn from his experience?
Well, it's interesting because just by happenstance, I had a conversation with Jose. And it was interesting because back in 2005 when P&G merged with Gillette, he had a challenge. His challenge was to merge the CIO organization. His charge from corporate was, we need someone to establish the beachhead. We need to have a test site where we can introduce practices, principles, concepts, so that we can learn, so that when we encompass the entire organization with that change, we have the practices in hand. So it was interesting because he had a challenge. His personal objective was not just to merge with Gillette, but to merge with Gillette in a manner where individuals from Gillette as well as PG were likely to remain with the organization. So he had a vision. He knew that in order to accomplish that vision, he had to bring the soldiers together. And the way he did that is he set governments, he set expectations, but he included them in deciding what are some of the incentives and controls that we need to put in place that will add the needed guidance and direction. And by working with them to set the guidance and direction, they bought in, they committed, and he was very proud to tell me that at the end of the process, a clear majority of the P&G and Gillette folks remain with the combined organization. That's unbelievable.
And so many times companies try to purchase innovation.
Yes.
So they say, we're going to go out and we're going to buy an ERP system, or we're going to buy a CRM system, or we're going to have this big big data initiative, and
right.
we're going to go buy our way into the future. but sometimes they forget about those very practical aspects of, well, they try to buy their way into the future by buying another company.
Exactly.
When they buy this other company, they forget that there's a whole culture. Sometimes there's disparate systems, there's different infrastructures.
Yes.
And so just to say, okay, well, this is going to be the new headquarters, and so everybody's going to conform to our, well, it's just not that easy.
That's exactly right.
There's a lot of other issues that go into that, and so your book delves into that in such a revealing kind of way. But because you have people that are educators, people that come from the nonprofit community,
yes.
it seems like you have a larger goal here, to really have this diverse set of practitioners have a mutual respect for the challenges that each other has. So for
yes.
maybe there's a way that the business person can be informed by the NGO, and the NGO can be informed by the government guy, so that there's a greater respect and appreciation. You know, there's a lot of talent out here
right.
that has different challenges and different scope. And if we just had appreciation for what each other is challenged with, I think that's a great part of your book. So it really speaks differently than so many other business books I've ever come across.
And again, you just took me back to our overarching framework. In addition to systems thinking and cognitive psychology, the third element we feel is game theory. And it's interesting because when you discuss game theory, you know, it's all about recognizing that we're all on a world stage and that our decisions will impact and influence others in a particular way, and we have to be thinking about how they might respond and react. But interestingly, when we discuss this with students, they typically think in terms of the world is the stage, everyone out there, they're our competitors. That's not the case. They are truly could be our allies, and some of our most valuable lessons learned and best practices could come with others. So that really is a common theme of the book, is that you need to open, you need to broaden your perspective, and you need to help others while in turn allowing them to help you.
One of the greatest aspects that I'm noticing today in my field of technology, but also in community development, is this notion of empowerment.
Yes.
That organizations that create platforms of empowerment
yes.
sometimes get benefits that otherwise they could not have imagined. So I was at a presentation last night with Google. And in this case, Google was presenting, they have a set effort of Google for nonprofits.
Yes.
And they make some of their technologies, their cloud services and application services, they make it available to nonprofits at no cost.
Right.
And this is so phenomenal to me, in that I think it's a win-win for both organizations, because what we find is some of the most creative and innovative and most high value engagement of stakeholders comes from these different types of organizations, and that can give the real aha moment back to the companies.
Exactly.
Where they say, we never would have thought of using our platform that way. And so I think that's what's so great about this environment that we live in now, and I think it's so great about is what can emerge from your work is a new way to lead. A new way to have the recognition that it's not just about who can get to the number fast enough.
Exactly.
But if you can have real commitment and engagement of not only your internal people, but the audiences and the communities you serve,
Exactly.
you may find that this gives you a level of staying power. And we've certainly seen that in the marketplace. There have been some companies that were given up for dead, but they weren't dead. Right. Because they were doing something in their community in a certain type of way that those people appreciated. Right. And they kept them around till that next wind of innovation came on stream, and then they were able to ride that next wave. So your book talks about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the strategic leadership types that we identified is called the incubator.
Okay.
And the incubator is all about harnessing and empowering others. Harnessing and empowering others to have unique ideas, creative ideas. To give you an example, 3M, they have two basic underlying principles that has fueled their development, their creativity over the last decades. They have a principle called 15% time. So if you're with 3M, if you are a technologist or if you're in the technology field or discipline, then they allow you to spend up to 15% of your time investigating, exploring items of personal interest. They're wanting you to focus on something that you are interested in, that you're excited about, that may or may not prove viable for them as a product, but they allow you to devote 15% of your time exploring potential new products, not from the organization's perspective, not their priority, but from yours. It also, it really impacts how they react to and respond to mistakes. At 3M, they realize that if you're going to innovate, all your ideas are not going to play out. And so if you make a mistake, they ask, what can we learn from it? How can you apply that in the future? Better yet, how can we share those lessons learned? Speaking of Google, Google now has 20% time. So they allow their folks to
stepped it up even more.
Yeah, devote up to 20% of their time on personal technology-related projects.
Well, BK Simerson, I want to thank you for enlightening myself and our audience with your great, passionate work in this arena of leading with strategic thinking. Obviously, you are committed to your work and your clients, and this is really your life's work because you do this in the real world of getting out, engaging in organizations, getting your hands dirty, and thanks so much for taking your lessons learned and putting them into a tome that we can now use as a guidepost for ourselves. I hope you have allowed us to have a conversation with you today about the importance of leading and the importance of leading with a consciousness of commitment to engagement, to inclusion, to diversity and opportunity. And when you do that, with some of the things that you can take from this book right here, you can have the kind of impact that changes things. Nothing is permanent. There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come, and put in the mind of the right leader can move mountains and change worlds. I want to thank my guest today, B. Keith Simerson, for joining me. And I want to thank you for supporting this work. And look for this new book, Leading with Strategic Thinking. I think you'll like it. My name is Bruce Montgomery. This has been another edition of Technology Access Television.